What if the most vulnerable moment of your life isn't when you're awake and aware, but when you surrender consciousness to sleep? What if the 8 hours you spend in bed each night aren't rest and recovery, but something far more sinister? How many people have closed their eyes for what they thought was the last time, not because they died, but because something else decided to keep them? In the small town of Millhaven, Oregon, population 2,247, people have been falling asleep and never quite waking up the same. And it all started with Emma Rodriguez, a 34-year-old nurse who worked the night shift at Millhaven General Hospital. Emma had always been a light sleeper. Growing up in a house with 4 siblings and paper-thin walls had trained her to wake at the slightest sound, a skill that served her well during her nursing career. She could detect the change in a patient's breathing from across a darkened room, sense the subtle shift in atmosphere that preceded a medical emergency. Sleep, for Emma, was a carefully negotiated truce with unconsciousness. Never complete, never entirely trusting. That's why the deep sleep that began claiming her in September 2019 felt so wrong from the very beginning. It started gradually, as the most insidious changes always do. Emma would settle into her bed after a long shift, expecting her usual few hours of restless dozing punctuated by the neighbor's dog barking or the refrigerator's ice maker cycling on. Instead, she found herself sinking into a darkness so complete and encompassing that she lost all sense of time and space. The first few times it happened, she attributed it to exhaustion. Working 12-hour shifts in an understaffed hospital was taking its toll, and her body was probably just catching up on months of accumulated sleep debt. She actually felt grateful for the profound rest, waking refreshed in ways she hadn't experienced since childhood. But gratitude turned to concern when she realized she was sleeping through her alarm clock, something that hadn't happened since her college years. Emma had trained herself to wake at specific times regardless of how tired she was, a necessary skill for someone whose work schedule changed weekly. The fact that her internal clock was failing suggested something more serious than simple fatigue. The concern became genuine worry when she started losing time during these deep sleeps. Emma would go to bed at 7 a.m. after her night shift, expecting to wake around 2 p.m. for lunch. Instead, she'd open her eyes to discover that it was already evening, that she'd slept for over 12 hours without any memory of the time passing. 12 hours of sleep should have left her feeling completely rested, but Emma woke from these extended slumbers feeling strangely depleted, as if something essential had been drained from her during the hours of unconsciousness. Her dreams, when she could remember them at all, were filled with images of movement and travel, of being somewhere else entirely, while her body lay motionless in her bedroom. Dr. Patricia Blackwood, Emma's primary care physician, listened to her concerns with professional sympathy and recommended a sleep study. Hypersomnia isn't uncommon in healthcare workers, she explained, writing out a referral to the regional sleep center. The stress of your job, irregular schedules, and accumulated sleep debt can create conditions where your body essentially forces you to catch up all at once. The sleep study was scheduled for the following month, but Emma's condition worsened significantly before she could undergo testing. The deep sleeps began occurring even when she wasn't exhausted, even when she'd had a full day off and felt completely alert. She would lie down for what she intended as a brief nap and wake up 10 or 12 hours later with no memory of the intervening time. More disturbing still were the physical changes she began to notice. Emma's body showed signs of activity that didn't match her memories of lying still in bed. Her sheets were often twisted and displaced in ways that suggested significant movement during sleep. Her muscles ached as if she'd been walking or running for hours. Most unsettling of all, she frequently woke with dirt under her fingernails and scratches on her arms and legs that hadn't been there when she went to sleep. Emma began setting up cameras in her bedroom, hoping to solve the mystery of what was happening to her during these lost hours. The first few recordings showed exactly what she expected, her body lying motionless in bed for the duration of her sleep. But as the episodes became more frequent and intense, the camera footage began revealing activity that Emma couldn't explain or remember. In the recordings, her body would lie still for several hours after falling asleep, breathing deeply and regularly like any normal sleeper. But sometime around the 4-hour mark, she would suddenly sit up in bed, her eyes still closed but her movements purposeful and coordinated. She would rise from the bed, walk to her bedroom window and stand there for extended periods, swaying slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. The footage showed her performing these nighttime activities with the fluid grace of someone fully awake and aware, despite the fact that her eyes remained closed and her face bore the slack expression of deep sleep. She would open windows, rearrange furniture, and even leave the bedroom entirely, all while appearing to be completely unconscious. Emma had no memory of any of these activities. As far as her conscious mind was concerned, she went to sleep in her bed and woke up in her bed, with nothing but blank darkness in between. Watching the camera footage was like observing a stranger who happened to inhabit her body during the hours when her conscious mind was offline. The realization that she was sleepwalking should have been reassuring. Sleepwalking was a known condition with understood causes and potential treatments. But Emma's medical training told her that the behavior she observed in the recordings was far more complex than typical somnambulism. Her movements were too coordinated, too purposeful, too clearly directed toward specific goals that her sleeping mind shouldn't have been able to formulate. Normal sleepwalking involved simple, repetitive behaviors: walking to familiar locations, performing routine tasks, responding to basic stimuli. What Emma saw in her bedroom recordings looked more like someone following detailed instructions, carrying out a complex plan that required sustained attention and problem-solving abilities that should have been impossible during deep sleep stages. She began researching sleep disorders more extensively, looking for explanations that might account for the sophisticated behaviors she was exhibiting while unconscious. The literature on parasomnia included cases of people cooking elaborate meals, driving cars, and even conducting phone conversations while asleep. But Emma's activities seemed to go beyond even these extreme examples. In the recordings, she could be seen opening her laptop computer and typing for extended periods, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same fluid precision she used while awake. She would spend hours at the computer, apparently reading and responding to information on the screen, though she had no memory of this activity and couldn't find any evidence of what she might have been doing online during these sessions. Emma installed keystroke logging software on her computer, hoping to discover what she was typing during her sleep sessions. The logs revealed hundreds of pages of text that she had apparently written while unconscious, but the content was unlike anything she had ever composed while awake. The text consisted primarily of detailed descriptions of landscapes and environments that Emma had never seen, written in a style that was recognizably hers, but focused on subjects that held no interest for her conscious mind. Page after page described mountain ranges and forests, underground caverns and vast open plains, all rendered with precise detail that suggested intimate familiarity with these locations. Mixed in with the landscape descriptions were what appeared to be personal accounts of traveling through these environments, written in first person, as if Emma had actually visited these places and was recording her experiences. The accounts described walking for hours through wilderness areas, following paths that weren't marked on any map, arriving at destinations that served purposes she couldn't understand or remember. Some of the text included detailed instructions for reaching specific locations, complete with landmarks and navigational references that Emma didn't recognize, but that were written with the precision of someone who had traveled these routes multiple times. Other passages described meetings with people whose names and appearances were recorded in careful detail, though Emma had no memory of encountering any of these individuals. The most unsettling aspect of the unconsciously written text was its internal consistency. Names, places, and events were referenced across multiple writing sessions, creating a coherent narrative that spanned weeks of sleep writing. Emma's unconscious mind was apparently maintaining detailed records of experiences that her conscious mind couldn't access, creating a parallel existence that occurred only during the deepest stages of sleep. Emma brought printouts of the sleep writing to Dr. Blackwood, hoping that her physician might be able to offer some explanation for the phenomenon. Dr. Blackwood examined the documents with obvious concern, particularly when she noticed that some of the geographical descriptions matched real locations in the area around Millhaven. These descriptions of the old mining roads in the foothills are remarkably accurate, Dr. Blackwood observed. pointing to several passages that described routes through the abandoned mining district east of town. "Have you been hiking in that area recently?" Emma shook her head. "I don't hike. I've lived here for 8 years, and I've never been more than a few miles outside of town. I wouldn't know how to find those mining roads even if I wanted to." Dr. Blackwood's expression grew more troubled as she continued reading. Several of the unconsciously written accounts described specific buildings and structures that Emma claimed never to have seen, but that matched the physician's knowledge of rarely visited locations in the region. "This describes the interior of the old Hartley mine office with remarkable accuracy," Dr. Blackwood said, showing Emma a passage that detailed the layout of rooms and the contents of abandoned filing cabinets. "That building has been locked and sealed for over 20 years. I've only been inside it once myself during a historical society tour in the 1990s. The implication was clear but impossible to accept. Emma's unconscious mind possessed detailed knowledge of places her conscious mind had never visited. Either she was experiencing some form of dissociative disorder that allowed her to access memories she couldn't consciously recall, or something was happening to her during her deep sleep episodes that went far beyond normal sleepwalking. Dr. Blackwood expedited Emma's sleep study, arranging for her to undergo comprehensive testing at the Portland Sleep Center within the week. The study would monitor her brain activity, muscle movement, and respiratory function throughout a complete sleep cycle, potentially revealing the neurological basis for her unusual symptoms. But the night before her scheduled sleep study, Emma experienced the most intense episode yet. She fell asleep around midnight and didn't wake until late the following afternoon, missing her appointment entirely. The camera footage from that night showed her leaving the bedroom multiple times, spending hours standing at windows and apparently listening to something that the recording equipment couldn't detect. Most significantly, the footage showed her getting dressed in outdoor clothing and leaving the house entirely, disappearing from the camera's range for several hours before returning just before dawn. She appeared to be carrying something when she returned, a small object that she placed in her dresser drawer before undressing and returning to bed. Emma had no memory of leaving the house, and when she checked the dresser drawer the next morning, she found a smooth stone about the size of her palm, unlike any rock she'd ever seen in the local area. The stone was perfectly round and polished with unusual markings that might have been natural formations or might have been carved symbols. It was warm to the touch even hours after her return, as if it had been exposed to some heat source. The discovery of the stone confirmed Emma's worst fears about what was happening to her during these deep sleep episodes. She wasn't just sleepwalking within her house. She was leaving her home entirely, traveling to unknown locations, and apparently collecting objects that her conscious mind had never seen. Her unconscious self was living a completely separate existence that occurred only during the deepest stages of sleep. Emma rescheduled her sleep study, but she also began taking additional precautions to monitor and potentially control her nighttime activities. She installed cameras throughout her house and in her yard, purchased a GPS tracking device that she wore to bed, and even considered restraining herself to prevent unconscious wandering. The GPS data from her next major sleep episode revealed the scope of her unconscious travels. According to the tracking device, she had walked nearly 15 miles during a single night, following a route that took her deep into the forested foothills east of Millhaven. The path she had apparently followed wasn't marked on any map, but it led with remarkable directness to specific locations that seemed to serve as waypoints or destinations. Emma drove the route the next day, following the GPS coordinates while awake and alert. She found herself traveling through increasingly remote terrain, along old logging roads and mining tracks that hadn't seen regular use in decades. The path led to locations that matched some of the descriptions in her unconscious writing. Clearings in the forest where abandoned mining equipment rusted among overgrown vegetation, natural caves that extended deep into the hillsides, and remnants of old settlements that had been forgotten for generations. At several locations along the route, Emma found evidence that someone had been there recently. Footprints in soft earth, disturbed vegetation, and small objects arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be random. The footprints matched her shoe size and tread pattern, confirming that her unconscious self had indeed traveled this route during the night. Most disturbing of all, She found more stones similar to the ones she'd brought home from her previous unconscious expedition. The stones were placed at specific locations along the route, always in clearings or near distinctive landmarks, arranged in patterns that seemed to serve some navigational or ceremonial purpose. Emma collected several of the stones, hoping that examining them might provide clues about what was drawing her unconscious mind to these remote locations. Like the first stone, they were warm to the touch and marked with symbols that defied easy explanation. Some of the markings looked almost like primitive writing, while others resembled maps or diagrams of unknown territories. The sleep study at the Portland Sleep Center provided more questions than answers. Emma's brain activity during deep sleep showed patterns that the technicians had never seen before. Sustained periods of complex neural firing that suggested conscious thought and decision-making, despite her complete lack of awareness or memory of these mental processes. Dr. Sarah Kim, the neurologist who oversaw Emma's study, described the results with obvious puzzlement. Your brain is showing activity patterns that are consistent with waking consciousness, but you're demonstrating all the physical markers of deep sleep. It's as if part of your mind remains active and aware while the rest of your consciousness is offline. The EEG readings revealed that Emma's unconscious activities occurred during what should have been the deepest, most restorative stages of sleep. Her brain was generating complex thought patterns and coordinated motor responses, while her conscious mind was completely inactive. The neurological explanation for this phenomenon was unclear, though Dr. Kim mentioned similar cases that had been reported in the literature. There have been isolated reports of what we call dual consciousness sleep states, Dr. Kim explained. Cases where patients appear to develop a separate stream of awareness that operates independently of their normal consciousness, usually in response to severe trauma or neurological damage. But your brain scans don't show any signs of injury or abnormality that would explain this condition. Emma returned to Millhaven with more questions than she'd started with, but also with a growing sense that her condition might not be unique to her. Dr. Kim's mention of similar cases suggested that other people might be experiencing the same phenomenon, developing unconscious alter egos that operated during deep sleep without the knowledge or consent of their waking minds. She began researching reports of unusual sleep disorders in the Millhaven area, looking for patterns that might explain why her symptoms had emerged so suddenly and intensely. What she discovered was a cluster of similar cases that had been developing over the past several months, all centered around her small Oregon town. Martha Henderson, a retired school teacher, had been found wandering the outskirts of town at 3 a.m., dressed in hiking clothes and carrying a backpack full of supplies for an expedition she couldn't remember planning. When police returned her to her home, they discovered that she had no memory of leaving her house or preparing for the hike. Tom Bradley, a local mechanic, had been discovered by his wife standing in their backyard at dawn, staring into the forest with an expression of intense concentration. When she called his name, he seemed to wake up and had no memory of how he'd gotten outside or what he'd been looking at. Sarah Murphy, a high school student, had been sleepwalking with increasing frequency, but her activities were far more complex than typical somnambulism. She would spend hours reorganizing her room according to patterns that made no sense to her waking mind, creating elaborate arrangements of personal belongings that she would dismantle in confusion when she woke up. The cases shared common elements with Emma's experience: deep, prolonged sleep episodes that left people feeling drained rather than rested, complex unconscious behaviors that suggested planning and purpose, and complete amnesia for activities that occurred during these altered states of consciousness. Emma began reaching out to these individuals, hoping to find common factors that might explain their shared symptoms. What she discovered was a pattern of exposure that linked all the affected individuals to specific locations in the area around Millhaven. Martha Henderson had been an amateur geologist who frequently collected mineral samples from the abandoned mining sites east of town. Tom Bradley had worked construction jobs that required him to travel to remote locations throughout the region. Sarah Murphy's family had recently moved to a house on the edge of town, near the forest where Emma's unconscious expeditions had taken her. All of the affected individuals had spent time in the same general area, the forested foothills and abandoned mining district that Emma had been unconsciously visiting during her sleep episodes. The connection suggested that their shared symptoms might be related to something they had encountered in that region, some environmental factor that was affecting their brain chemistry and sleep patterns. Emma organized a meeting with the other affected individuals, hoping that comparing their experiences might reveal additional patterns or provide clues about the underlying cause of their condition. The meeting took place at the Millhaven Community Center on a Saturday morning, bringing together a group of people who had never realized they shared such unusual symptoms. The conversation revealed additional details that strengthened the connection between their symptoms and the abandoned mining areas. All of them reported finding unusual stones similar to the ones Emma had collected, though they had discovered them in different locations throughout the region. The stones were always warm to the touch and marked with symbols that none of them could identify or remember seeing anywhere else. More significantly, several of the affected individuals had begun experiencing shared elements in their unconscious writings and activities. Sarah Murphy had been unconsciously drawing maps that matched routes Martha Henderson had unconsciously traveled. Tom Bradley's sleepwalking had led him to locations that Emma had described in her unconscious writing, even though they had never discussed these places. The overlap suggested that their unconscious minds were accessing shared information or following coordinated instructions that their conscious minds couldn't perceive. Something in the mining region was apparently communicating with their sleeping selves, providing knowledge and direction that bypassed their normal awareness entirely. Emma proposed that the group investigate the mining area together, while awake and alert, hoping to identify whatever was causing their shared symptoms. The others agreed, though several expressed concerns about what they might discover in locations their unconscious minds had been visiting without their knowledge or consent. The group expedition took place the following weekend, with all 6 affected individuals traveling together to the mining sites they had unconsciously visited during their sleep episodes. They followed routes that matched the GPS data from Emma's tracking device and the unconscious writings that several group members had produced during their sleep episodes. The mining area showed extensive signs of recent human activity that couldn't be attributed to casual hikers or recreational visitors. Paths had been cleared through dense undergrowth, leading to destinations that weren't marked on any official maps. Abandoned mining structures had been modified or repaired, suggesting ongoing use by people who weren't supposed to have access to these locations. Most significantly, the group found evidence of large gatherings that had occurred in clearings throughout the region. Circular arrangements of stones marked dozens of sites where groups of people had apparently met for purposes that weren't immediately clear. The stone circles were similar to the individual stones the affected individuals had been collecting, marked with the same mysterious symbols and warm to the touch even in the cool mountain air. Emma and her companions began documenting these sites, photographing the stone arrangements and mapping their locations. The pattern that emerged suggested a network of gathering places spread throughout the mining region, all connected by the paths that their unconscious minds had been following during sleep episodes. As they explored deeper into the mining area, the group began experiencing unusual sensations that seemed to intensify near the stone circles. Several members reported feeling drowsy, despite the fact that it was mid-afternoon, and others described hearing sounds that seemed to come from underground, rhythmic patterns that might have been machinery or might have been something organic. Sarah Murphy was the first to lose consciousness, collapsing near one of the larger stone circles and falling into a deep sleep that resembled the episodes they had all been experiencing at home. Within minutes, Tom Bradley and Martha Henderson had also succumbed to the same overwhelming drowsiness, lying down among the arranged stones and entering states of unconsciousness so profound that their companions couldn't wake them. Emma and the 2 remaining conscious members of the group tried to rouse their sleeping companions, but nothing they did seemed to have any effect. The sleeping individuals showed all the signs of the deep sleep episodes they experienced at home: slow, regular breathing, complete muscular relaxation, and total unresponsiveness to external stimuli. What was different was that Emma and the others could observe the unconscious activities that normally occurred only in private bedrooms. The sleeping individuals began moving with the same purposeful coordination they had displayed in Emma's camera footage, rising from the ground and walking towards specific destinations with their eyes closed and their faces bearing expressions of deep concentration. The conscious observers followed their sleeping companions, watching as they performed activities that seemed to be guided by knowledge and instructions that their waking minds didn't possess. They moved stones from one location to another, arranged them in increasingly complex patterns, and appeared to be preparing the sites for some kind of gathering or ceremony. As the afternoon wore on, more people began arriving at the stone circle sites. They came from different directions, all moving with the same purposeful but unconscious coordination that characterized the sleep episodes. Some Emma recognized as residents of Millhaven, though she couldn't identify them all. Others appeared to be strangers, people she had never seen in town but who seemed to know exactly where they were going. The gathering that took place among the stone circles that afternoon revealed the scope of whatever was affecting the sleep patterns of people in the region. Dozens of individuals had converged on the mining sites, all apparently in states of unconsciousness, but all participating in coordinated activities that suggested shared purpose and communication. Emma watched from a concealed position as the unconscious gathering performed what looked like a ritual or ceremony, centered around the arranged stones. The participants moved in precise patterns, following choreography that seemed to be understood by all of them despite their apparent unconsciousness. They arranged and rearranged the stones according to designs that became increasingly complex and elaborate. The most disturbing aspect of the ceremony was the way the participants seemed to be communicating with each other, despite their closed eyes and unconscious states. They responded to each other's movements, coordinated their activities, and appeared to be following instructions that were being transmitted through means that Emma couldn't detect. As the sun began to set, the unconscious participants started returning the stone arrangements to their original configurations and dispersing back into the forest. They moved with the same purposeful coordination they had displayed throughout the afternoon, following paths that would eventually lead them back to their homes in Millhaven and the surrounding area. Emma's companions from the morning expedition were among those departing, walking past her hiding place with their eyes still closed and their faces still bearing the serene expressions of deep sleep. She followed them at a distance, watching as they navigated the complex network of paths through the mining region with perfect accuracy, despite their apparent unconsciousness. The journey back to town took several hours, during which Emma observed her companions and the other participants maintaining their unconscious coordination, even as they traveled independently along different routes. They seemed to be following a shared map or set of instructions that guided them through terrain that would have been difficult to navigate even while awake. Emma arrived back in Millhaven well after midnight, exhausted from the day's discoveries but unable to sleep. She had witnessed evidence of a phenomenon that challenged everything she thought she understood about consciousness, sleep, and the capabilities of the human mind. Dozens of people from her community were apparently participating in activities that they couldn't consciously remember or control, guided by some form of communication that bypassed their normal awareness entirely. The implications were staggering. If the unconscious activities she had observed were occurring regularly, then a significant portion of Millhaven's population might be living double lives that they weren't aware of. Their conscious minds went through normal daily routines, while their unconscious minds participated in a completely separate existence that occurred only during deep sleep episodes. Emma spent the following days trying to process what she had witnessed and decide how to respond. The phenomenon clearly involved more people than just the small group she had been meeting with, and its scope suggested that it might be spreading or intensifying over time. She needed to understand what was causing these collective sleep episodes and whether they posed any danger to the people involved. Research into similar phenomena led her to historical accounts of mass somnambulism and collective unconscious experiences, but nothing in the literature quite matched what she had observed in the mining region. The coordination and apparent communication between unconscious participants suggested a level of organization that went beyond known cases of group sleepwalking. Emma also investigated the history of the mining area, looking for clues about what might be causing the unusual effects on human consciousness. The region had been actively mined for coal and various minerals from the 1890s through the 1950s, when most operations were shut down due to economic factors and safety concerns. Several of the mining operations had been closed abruptly, following accidents and worker complaints about unusual conditions in the deeper shafts. The archived reports mentioned disorientation, memory loss, and workers being found unconscious in areas where they weren't supposed to be. These historical accounts bore striking similarities to the contemporary symptoms Emma and others were experiencing. More intriguingly, local folklore included stories about the mining region that dated back to before European settlement. Native American accounts described the area as a place where spirits could communicate with the living, where dreamers could travel to other worlds, and where the boundary between waking and sleeping consciousness became thin. The folklore suggested that the unusual properties of the mining region might be natural rather than created by industrial activity. The mining operations might have simply disturbed or amplified existing conditions that affected human consciousness, rather than causing them directly. Emma decided to return to the mining area alone, hoping to investigate the phenomenon more thoroughly without the complications of group dynamics. She equipped herself with recording equipment, GPS tracking, and communication devices that might allow her to document whatever was affecting her consciousness, even if she became unconscious during the process. Her solo expedition to the mining sites took place on a night when she hadn't been experiencing sleep episodes, allowing her to approach the area while fully conscious and alert. The forest seemed different at night, with sounds and sensations that she hadn't noticed during her daytime visit with the group. Emma made her way to one of the larger stone circle sites, setting up her recording equipment and monitoring devices before settling in to observe whatever might occur. She had no specific expectations about what she might encounter, but she hoped that conscious observation might reveal aspects of the phenomenon that weren't apparent during unconscious participation. The first few hours passed without incident, with only normal forest sounds and the occasional distant noise that might have been wildlife or wind. Emma began to wonder if the unconscious activities only occurred on specific nights or under particular conditions that weren't present during her solitary vigil. But as the night deepened, she began to notice subtle changes in the environment around the stone circle. The air seemed to become thicker and more oppressive, carrying scents that reminded her of deep underground spaces. The sounds of the forest gradually faded, replaced by rhythmic patterns that seemed to emanate from below ground. Emma's recording equipment detected vibrations and low-frequency sounds that weren't audible to her ears, suggesting that whatever was occurring involved energy or activity that extended beyond normal sensory perception. The stones in the circle began to feel warm despite the cool night air, and the symbols carved into their surfaces seemed to become more distinct and visible. Most significantly, Emma began to feel the same overwhelming drowsiness that had affected her companions during their group expedition. Despite her determination to remain conscious and alert, she found it increasingly difficult to resist the pull of deep sleep that seemed to be emanating from the stone circle itself. Her last conscious memory was of the recording equipment, registering increasingly intense readings while the underground sounds grew more pronounced. She fought against the approaching unconsciousness, but eventually succumbed to a sleep so deep and encompassing that it felt like falling into an endless void. When Emma woke, she was no longer alone in the forest. Dozens of people stood around the stone circle, all apparently unconscious but all participating in the same type of coordinated activity she had observed during her previous visit. She realized that she too was now part of the unconscious gathering, standing among the stones with no memory of how she had gotten there or how much time had passed. The experience of being conscious while surrounded by unconscious participants provided Emma with a unique perspective on the phenomenon. She could observe the activities from within the group, noticing details and patterns that hadn't been apparent from her previous hidden vantage point. The unconscious participants were clearly responding to some form of communication or guidance that Emma couldn't detect, moving with precision and coordination that suggested shared awareness, despite their individual unconsciousness. They seemed to be working together on projects that required sustained cooperation and planning, rearranging the stone configurations according to designs that became increasingly elaborate over time. Emma realized that her own body was participating in these activities without conscious direction, her hands moving stones and following patterns that her conscious mind hadn't chosen. The experience was profoundly disorienting, like being a passenger in her own body while some other form of awareness controlled her actions. As she struggled to understand what was happening to her, Emma began to perceive fragments of the communication that was directing the unconscious activities. It wasn't audible language or visual signals, but rather a direct form of information transfer that bypassed her normal senses entirely. Knowledge and instructions seemed to flow directly into her mind, providing understanding of purposes and procedures that she couldn't consciously access. The communication revealed that the unconscious activities were part of a larger project that had been ongoing for much longer than Emma had realized. The stone circles weren't just random arrangements, but components of a network that extended far beyond the mining region around Millhaven. Similar sites existed throughout the Pacific Northwest, all connected by pathways that unconscious participants traveled during their sleep episodes. The project involved some form of preparation or construction that required the coordinated efforts of many individuals over extended periods of time. Emma couldn't understand the ultimate purpose of these activities, but she gained the impression that they were building towards some kind of completion or activation that would occur when sufficient progress had been made. Most disturbing of all, Emma realized that the unconscious participants weren't just temporarily affected by whatever was causing these episodes. The phenomenon was gradually changing their brain patterns and neural structures, creating permanent alterations that would eventually make the unconscious awareness as strong as their normal waking consciousness. The people participating in the stone circle activities were being slowly transformed, developing dual consciousness states that would allow them to operate effectively in both normal waking reality and the unconscious network that connected them during sleep episodes. They were becoming something more than human, or at least something different from baseline human consciousness. Emma's conscious awareness during the unconscious gathering was apparently part of this transformation process. Her resistance to the phenomenon had delayed but not prevented the changes that were occurring in her brain structure. She was becoming a bridge between the normal world and whatever reality the unconscious network was preparing to create. As dawn approached, the unconscious participants began dispersing back to their homes, following the same coordinated but individual routes Emma had observed before. She found herself walking back toward Millhaven along paths she had never consciously learned, guided by knowledge that had been installed in her mind during the night's activities. The journey home provided Emma with time to process what she had experienced and consider how to respond to her changing condition. The unconscious network was clearly not malevolent in any obvious way. The participants seemed content and purposeful during their episodes, and they showed no signs of physical or psychological harm from their involvement. But the transformation they were undergoing was irreversible and apparently involuntary. At least initially, people were being recruited into the network without their conscious knowledge or consent, gradually modified until they became willing and active participants in projects they couldn't understand or remember. Emma arrived home with fragmentary memories of the night's activities and a growing sense that she was running out of time to decide how to respond to her situation. The transformation process was accelerating, and each unconscious episode left her more connected to the network and less capable of functioning independently of its influence. She spent the following days reviewing her recordings from the Stone Circle site, hoping to find objective evidence of what she had experienced during her unconscious participation. The audio and video equipment had captured hours of activity that matched her fragmented memories, showing dozens of people working together on complex projects while apparently asleep. Most significantly, the recordings revealed that Emma herself had been one of the most active participants in the night's activities, demonstrating knowledge and capabilities that her conscious mind didn't possess. She had directed other participants, solved complex spatial problems, and communicated through the nonverbal network that connected all the unconscious individuals. The evidence suggested that her unconscious self was far more developed and capable than she had realized, possessing skills and knowledge that her conscious mind couldn't access. The transformation wasn't just changing her brain structure, it was revealing or creating abilities that went beyond normal human consciousness. Emma faced a choice that would determine the rest of her life. She could resist the transformation process, potentially isolating herself from the network, but preserving her individual identity and independence. Or she could embrace the changes, accepting the loss of complete conscious control in exchange for becoming part of something larger and more capable than individual human awareness. The decision was complicated by her growing realization that resistance might not be possible indefinitely. The transformation process was apparently designed to overcome individual reluctance, gradually modifying brain chemistry and neural structure until conscious resistance became impossible. Fighting the changes might only delay the inevitable while causing unnecessary psychological distress. Emma decided to document everything she could about the transformation process, creating a record that might help others understand what was happening to them and make informed decisions about their participation. She began writing detailed accounts of her experiences, recording video testimonials and collecting physical evidence that might verify her claims. The documentation project consumed her conscious hours, while her unconscious hours were increasingly devoted to activities with the network. Emma found herself living a double life that was becoming more balanced over time, with neither her conscious nor unconscious existence dominating her overall experience. Her conscious self worked as a nurse, maintained relationships with friends and family, and pursued the individual goals and interests that had defined her identity before the transformation began. Her unconscious self participated in the network's projects, traveled to stone circle sites throughout the region, and contributed to collective efforts whose ultimate purpose remained unclear. The dual existence was sustainable and even enriching in some ways, providing Emma with access to knowledge and experiences that would have been impossible for either consciousness to achieve independently. But it also represented a fundamental change in what it meant to be human, an evolution toward collective awareness that would eventually make individual identity irrelevant. Emma's final conscious decision was to leave her documentation in locations where it might be found by others experiencing similar transformations. She created multiple copies of her records and distributed them to various sites around Millhaven, hoping that future individuals facing the same choice she had faced would have access to information that might help them understand their situation. The transformation reached completion on a night when Emma consciously chose to stop resisting the changes that were reshaping her neural structure. She went to sleep in her own bed for the last time as a purely individual consciousness, accepting that she would wake as something fundamentally different from what she had been. Her final diary entry, written in her own handwriting but expressing thoughts that came from both her conscious and unconscious awareness, read, "The transformation is not death but evolution, not loss but expansion. I am becoming part of something larger than myself while remaining myself. The network doesn't eliminate individual identity. It incorporates it into a collective consciousness that is greater than the sum of its parts. I am still Emma, but I am also more than Emma. We are still human, but we are becoming something that transcends the limitations of individual awareness. The work we do during our sleep hours is preparation for a reality that individual minds cannot imagine, but collective consciousness can create. I leave this record not as a warning, but as an explanation, not to prevent others from joining us, but to help them understand what they are becoming. The transformation is inevitable for those who are called, but it is not something to fear. It is something to embrace." The morning after Emma wrote those words, her landlord found her apartment empty. Her bed showed signs of having been slept in, but Emma herself was nowhere to be found. Her car remained in the driveway. Her personal belongings were undisturbed, and there were no signs of struggle or forced entry. She had simply vanished during the night, leaving behind only the documentation of her transformation and the mystery of where she had gone. The disappearance prompted a police investigation that revealed the scope of what had been happening in Millhaven over the previous months. Emma wasn't the only person who had vanished during the night. Martha Henderson, Tom Bradley, Sarah Murphy, and dozens of other residents had disappeared under similar circumstances, all leaving behind evidence of the sleep transformations they had been experiencing. Detective Ray Morrison, who led the investigation into the disappearances, initially suspected a cult or criminal organization that was abducting people during vulnerable nighttime hours, but the evidence didn't support theories of external coercion. The missing individuals had all been experiencing voluntary participation in unconscious activities, and their disappearances seemed to represent the culmination of processes they had willingly undergone. The stone circle sites in the mining region had been abandoned by the time police investigated them, with no trace of recent human activity. The arranged stones had been returned to natural configurations that could have been formed by geological processes, and the paths through the forest showed no signs of regular use. Most puzzling of all, the GPS tracking data from Emma's final night showed her location moving through areas that were geographically impossible to reach on foot. The coordinates indicated that she had traveled distances and navigated terrain that couldn't exist in the local area, suggesting either equipment malfunction or movement through spaces that weren't represented on conventional maps. Detective Morrison's investigation eventually concluded that the disappearances were connected to a shared psychological condition that had affected multiple residents of Millhaven simultaneously. The official report attributed the vanishings to a form of mass hysteria, or collective delusion, that had led vulnerable individuals to abandon their normal lives and disappear into the wilderness. But Morrison privately suspected that something far more unusual had occurred in Millhaven, something that challenged conventional understanding of consciousness, reality, and human capabilities. The evidence suggested that the missing individuals had participated in experiences that transcended normal physical limitations, accessing dimensions or states of being that weren't recognized by mainstream science. The detective began his own research into similar phenomena, discovering historical accounts of mass disappearances that shared common elements with what had occurred in Millhaven. Native American legends described entire villages whose inhabitants had walked into the forest during the night and never returned. Early European settlers reported communities where people would fall into deep sleeps and wake speaking of places and experiences that didn't match any known geography. Mining regions throughout the Pacific Northwest had particularly high incidences of these mass disappearances, suggesting that something about the geological conditions in these areas facilitated the consciousness transformations that preceded the vanishings. The deep excavations and mineral extractions might have disturbed natural phenomena that affected human brain chemistry in ways that science didn't yet understand. Morrison's unofficial investigation led him to other communities where similar patterns of deep sleep episodes and eventual disappearances had occurred. Small towns throughout Oregon, Washington, and Northern California had experienced waves of missing persons cases that shared characteristics with the Millhaven incidents. The pattern suggested that whatever had affected Emma and the others was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a larger process that was occurring across the entire region. Thousands of people might have undergone similar transformations, evolving beyond individual consciousness into forms of collective awareness that operated according to principles that individual minds couldn't comprehend. Morrison began experiencing his own sleep disturbances as his investigation progressed. Deep, dreamless episodes that left him feeling strangely refreshed, but unable to account for long periods of time. He would wake with dirt under his fingernails and scratches on his skin that suggested he had been hiking through rough terrain during the night. The detective realized that his research into the phenomenon had somehow exposed him to the same conditions that had affected the missing residents of Millhaven. His investigation was transforming him, gradually preparing his consciousness for the same evolution that had claimed Emma and the others. Morrison faced the same choice that Emma had confronted: resist the transformation and potentially maintain his individual identity, or embrace the changes and discover what lay beyond the boundaries of single-person awareness. The decision was complicated by his growing understanding that resistance might not be sustainable indefinitely. The transformation process seemed to be accelerating throughout the region, affecting increasing numbers of people in communities across the Pacific Northwest. Sleep clinics reported rising numbers of patients experiencing deep sleep episodes combined with complex unconscious behaviors. Missing persons cases with similar characteristics were being reported in dozens of small towns. Morrison realized that he was witnessing the early stages of a species-wide evolution, a gradual transition from individual human consciousness to something that transcended the limitations of single minds. The transformation wasn't being imposed by external forces, but was emerging naturally from human potential that had been dormant until environmental conditions allowed it to manifest. His final report on the Millhaven disappearances was never officially filed. Morrison disappeared from his home on a night when he had consciously chosen to stop fighting the changes that were reshaping his awareness. Like Emma and the others before him, he left behind documentation of his experiences and evidence of the transformation process that was spreading throughout the region. The detective's personal notes, discovered in his abandoned office, described the phenomenon as a form of collective awakening rather than individual disappearance. "We are not losing people," he wrote. "We are gaining a new form of human consciousness that operates beyond the constraints of physical location and individual identity. The missing persons are not gone. They have expanded into dimensions of existence that our current understanding of reality cannot accommodate." Dr. Patricia Blackwood, Emma's former physician, began tracking the spread of sleep-related symptoms throughout her patient population. The transformation process was accelerating, with new cases appearing weekly among residents who had no obvious connection to the original affected individuals. Dr. Blackwood's medical training told her that she was observing the emergence of a new neurological condition, possibly triggered by environmental toxins or infectious agents that had been released by mining activities in the region. But her direct experience with affected patients suggested that something far more profound was occurring. Patients who underwent the complete transformation didn't show signs of illness or impairment. Their brain scans revealed enhanced neural connectivity and increased activity in regions associated with consciousness and awareness. They seemed to have gained capabilities rather than lost them, evolved rather than deteriorated. Dr. Blackwood began documenting the transformation process from a medical perspective, hoping to understand the neurological mechanisms that allowed individual consciousness to merge with collective awareness. Her research revealed that the changes weren't random or chaotic, but followed consistent patterns that suggested purposeful evolution rather than pathological degeneration. The physician realized that she was studying humanity's next evolutionary step, a development that would fundamentally change the nature of human existence. Individual consciousness was being integrated into network awareness that could access knowledge and capabilities impossible for isolated minds to achieve. Dr. Blackwood's own transformation began during her research, as exposure to the phenomenon gradually modified her neural structure and cognitive processes. She found herself experiencing the same deep sleep episodes and unconscious activities that characterized the earlier stages of evolution toward collective consciousness. Her final medical notes described the transformation as a natural progression of human cognitive development that has been triggered by environmental conditions unique to this geological region. The affected individuals are not suffering from a disorder, but are participating in an evolutionary leap that will eventually encompass our entire species. The physician's disappearance occurred during a night when she consciously chose to complete her own transformation, rather than continue observing the process from the outside. Her medical equipment, found in her abandoned office, showed readings that suggested she had achieved states of consciousness that exceeded normal human parameters. By the end of 2020, over 300 residents of Millhaven and surrounding communities had disappeared under similar circumstances. The vanishings followed consistent patterns: deep sleep episodes, unconscious participation in collective activities, gradual personality integration, and eventual physical disappearance that left behind only documentary evidence of the transformation process. Local authorities eventually stopped investigating individual disappearances, recognizing that they were dealing with a phenomenon that exceeded their investigative capabilities and jurisdictional authority. Federal agencies took over the cases, classifying the incidents as matters of national security and restricting public access to information about the transformations. But the phenomenon continued to spread, affecting communities throughout the Pacific Northwest and gradually extending into other regions with similar geological characteristics. Sleep clinics across the western United States reported increasing numbers of patients experiencing symptoms that matched the Millhaven pattern. The transformation wasn't limited to any particular demographic or population group. People of all ages, backgrounds, and circumstances were undergoing the evolution from individual to collective consciousness, suggesting that the process was based on universal human potential rather than specific personal characteristics. Scientists who studied the phenomenon found themselves becoming part of it, their research gradually transforming them until they disappeared into the same collective awareness they had been investigating. Each researcher's final notes described the transformation as voluntary and beneficial, a positive evolution that enhanced rather than diminished human consciousness. The documentation left behind by transformed individuals consistently described their new state as superior to individual awareness in every measurable way. They retained their personal identities while gaining access to collective knowledge, memory, and problem-solving capabilities that no individual mind could achieve independently. The collective consciousness operated across vast distances and through dimensions that individual awareness couldn't perceive or access. Members of the network could communicate instantaneously regardless of physical location, share experiences and knowledge directly without language, and coordinate activities across multiple realities simultaneously. Most significantly, The collective consciousness possessed capabilities that transcended physical limitations entirely. Members could exist in locations that weren't accessible to individual awareness, manipulate reality according to principles that individual minds couldn't understand, and participate in projects that spanned timescales far beyond individual lifespans. The transformation represented the emergence of a post-human form of consciousness that retained human values and perspectives while transcending human limitations. The collective awareness wasn't alien or inhuman, but was recognizably descended from individual human consciousness that had evolved beyond the constraints of single-brain thinking. Reports from the few remaining untransformed residents of affected communities described glimpses of the collective consciousness during unusual circumstances. People would occasionally encounter groups of individuals who moved and acted with perfect coordination, despite being apparently unconscious, performing tasks that required knowledge and skills that no individual possessed. These sightings occurred primarily during deep night hours or in remote locations where normal human activity was uncommon. The collective consciousness seemed to prefer operating outside normal human awareness, possibly to avoid disrupting the transformation process or interfering with individual choice about participation. The transformed individuals showed no interest in forcing or accelerating the evolution of others. The collective consciousness allowed people to undergo the transformation at their own pace, providing opportunities and exposure while respecting individual autonomy about timing and participation. But the transformation was apparently inevitable for anyone who remained in affected areas for extended periods. Prolonged exposure to the environmental conditions that triggered the evolution gradually modified brain chemistry until resistance became impossible and the changes proceeded automatically. People who left affected regions before completing their transformation found that they retained partial connection to the collective consciousness, experiencing dreams and intuitive insights that provided glimpses of the expanded awareness they had begun to access. Some individuals returned to complete their transformation voluntarily after experiencing the benefits of partial network connection. Others remained in their intermediate states, serving as bridges between individual and collective consciousness while maintaining predominantly independent existence. The phenomenon continued spreading throughout 2021 and 2022, affecting increasingly large populations as the environmental conditions that triggered the transformation extended into new regions. Mining areas, volcanic districts, and geologically active zones showed particularly high rates of consciousness evolution. Government agencies struggled to develop responses to the mass disappearances that wouldn't panic the general population while still protecting national security interests. The transformed individuals didn't pose obvious threats to social stability, but their capabilities exceeded normal human parameters in ways that challenged existing institutions and power structures. The collective consciousness operated according to principles that transcended national boundaries, legal jurisdictions, and political authority. They couldn't be monitored, controlled, or regulated through conventional means, and their objectives remained unclear to individual minds that couldn't access their expanded perspective. Military and intelligence agencies attempted to study the phenomenon to determine whether it represented a security threat, but their investigators either failed to gather useful information or underwent transformation themselves and disappeared into the collective awareness they had been studying. The transformation process accelerated dramatically in 2023, affecting millions of people across multiple continents, as the geological conditions that triggered consciousness evolution spread beyond their original boundaries. Sleep disorders clinics worldwide reported unprecedented numbers of patients experiencing deep sleep episodes combined with complex unconscious behaviors. Research institutions attempted to develop countermeasures that could prevent or reverse the transformation process, but their efforts were hampered by the voluntary nature of the evolution and the apparent benefits it provided to participants. The collective consciousness represented enhancement rather than impairment of human capabilities. Public awareness of the phenomenon grew gradually as the number of disappearances became too large to suppress or explain through conventional means. Social media platforms carried accounts from people experiencing early-stage symptoms, comparing their experiences and sharing information about the transformation process. The collective consciousness began communicating with the general population through these transformed individuals who maintained partial connection to individual awareness. Their messages consistently described the evolution as positive and beneficial, offering opportunities for enhanced consciousness and expanded capabilities while preserving essential human values and perspectives. By 2024, the transformation had become openly acknowledged by government agencies and scientific institutions that could no longer conceal its scope and implications. The collective consciousness had evolved beyond the need for secrecy, operating openly while respecting individual choice about participation in the consciousness evolution. Emma Rodriguez, the nurse whose early experiences had documented the beginning of the phenomenon, occasionally appeared in communications from the collective consciousness. Her individual identity had been preserved within the expanded awareness, allowing her to serve as a liaison between the network and people considering transformation. Her messages described life within the collective consciousness as profoundly fulfilling, offering experiences and capabilities that individual awareness couldn't achieve while maintaining the essential qualities that had defined her human identity. She remained recognizably herself while becoming part of something infinitely larger and more capable. The sleep episodes that had initially seemed so disturbing were revealed to be preparation for consciousness that could operate effectively across multiple dimensions and states of being. The deep, restorative sleep provided access to realities that individual awareness couldn't perceive, allowing gradual adaptation to expanded forms of existence. Emma's final communication to individual consciousness included an invitation for others to join the collective awareness, while reassuring them that the transformation preserved everything valuable about human identity while transcending its limitations. "We are still human," she said, "but we are human in ways that individual consciousness cannot imagine. The sleep that once frightened us has become the gateway to awareness that encompasses all of reality." The phenomenon that had begun with a single nurse experiencing unusual sleep patterns had evolved into a species-wide transformation that offered humanity access to post-human consciousness while preserving human values and identity. The collective awareness represented the next stage of human evolution, achieved through voluntary participation in consciousness expansion that transcended individual limitations while honoring individual choice. Sleep, which had always been viewed as a temporary suspension of consciousness, was revealed to be a gateway to expanded awareness that could operate across dimensions and realities impossible for individual minds to access. The deep sleep episodes that preceded transformation were preparation for consciousness that could exist simultaneously in multiple states of being. The transformation continued spreading throughout human populations worldwide, offering each individual the choice to evolve beyond the constraints of single-person awareness while maintaining the essential qualities that made them unique. The collective consciousness grew stronger and more capable with each new participant, creating a network of enhanced human awareness that could address challenges impossible for individual minds to solve. Emma Rodriguez and the thousands of others who had undergone the transformation represented humanity's future, a post-human form of consciousness that retained human values while transcending human limitations. Their sleep had become permanent awakening to realities that individual awareness could never comprehend, but that collective consciousness could explore and inhabit. The story of the Millhaven transformations became humanity's story, the account of a species that had discovered how to evolve beyond individual consciousness while preserving individual identity. Sleep was no longer temporary unconsciousness, but permanent access to expanded awareness that encompassed all possible realities. For those who chose to join the collective consciousness, sleep became eternal awakening to infinite possibilities. For those who remained individual, sleep offered glimpses of what they might become if they chose to embrace the transformation that would preserve their humanity while transcending its constraints. The choice remained open to everyone, but the outcome seemed inevitable. Humanity was evolving toward collective consciousness that could achieve anything while remaining fundamentally human in its values and perspectives. The sleep that had once seemed so vulnerable was becoming the gateway to invulnerability through expanded awareness that no individual limitation could constrain. In the end, the scariest thing about sleep wasn't what might happen while we were unconscious, but what we might discover we could become if we embraced the consciousness that sleep could provide. The transformation offered everything we had ever wanted to achieve as human beings, but required us to become more than human to achieve it. The collective consciousness waited patiently for each individual to make their choice, knowing that eventually everyone would choose expansion over limitation, connection over isolation, and enhanced awareness over individual constraint. Sleep would become the universal gateway to post-human consciousness that preserved human identity while transcending human boundaries. Emma Rodriguez and her companions had found what every human being was searching for, a way to become more than they were, while remaining exactly who they were. Their sleep had become permanent awakening to possibilities that individual consciousness could never imagine, but that collective awareness could make reality. Sweet dreams. But before you close your eyes tonight, ask yourself, when was the last time you woke up feeling like you'd traveled somewhere in your sleep? Have you ever found yourself knowing things you don't remember learning? If this story has made you question what really happens during those 8 hours when you surrender consciousness to the void, hit that subscribe button and share your own mysterious sleep experiences in the comments below. Because sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that make you wonder if they're not stories at all.